Greetings. I'm Armaan Mathur, a first year MA in Law and Diplomacy candidate at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I'm from New Delhi, India, and graduated with honors in political science from the University of Delhi. With this background in political science and international affairs, I view global justice both as an idea and a mechanizable principle. My presentation is going to thus focus on the application of the concept of global justice to the virtual world, digital justice. I shall apply digital justice principles to one of the shiniest new UN initiatives, the Global Digital Compact, or the GDC. In the spirit of Yale's Global Justice Program, my emphasis on digital justice will try to explicate for you the linkage between global institutional arrangements, or in this case, the lack thereof, to the creation of disparate outcomes domestically, especially in the global south. I seek to do so by evaluating the GDC's placement as the solution to the digital governance puzzle. I'll focus on highlighting some of the flaws inherent in the institutionalization and why it's woefully inadequate as it stands to stand up to the principles of digital justice. I define digital justice very broadly as the equitable treatment of people in access and participation in technology and information, regardless of their descriptive identities. By the end of this video, I hope to have demonstrated how the GDC needs a lot of work, and in many ways, it perpetuates the very injustices that it seeks to ameliorate. Let's begin very briefly with what the GDC is. Global governance of the internet eluded us for a very long time. Platforms existed for debate, discussion, dissent, but the institutionalization of the norms in the digital space were very fragmented. That's what we call the splinternet. Splintered because of nationalism, politics, commerce, religion, a variety of other factors. The current Secretary General of the UN recognized this, and he launched the GDC as this comprehensive framework, which became the landmark UN effort to create an open, well-regulated, inclusive digital space. The rationale is great, but, and that's where we come in, the institutionalization needs a lot of work. The first issue we need to focus on is what underlies the GDC, the explicit linkage to the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030. Now, the problem with the Global Digital Compact grounding itself in the normative sheath of Agenda 2030 is that it inevitably ends up glossing over the pitfalls of Sustainable Development Goals in practice. It ends up being impervious to the fact that it's based on the same principle of accumulation and exploitation of the global south that's very problematic in practice. It largely ends up masking the north south divide and disadvantages low income countries. We need to be very careful about creating a normative basis for an equitable world order. And if we do that in terms of the Agenda 2030, we need to be very careful of what we actually are trying to articulate about the global north south divide. Research, unfortunately, has shown that divide not only continues, it's actually worsened. Participants from low-income countries, as you will see on your screen, are involved in far fewer partnerships than partners from countries in all other World Bank income groups. Not only are low-income countries least able to advance their sustainable development independently, they are most in need of capacity building and support, and they are most disadvantaged by the North-South divide. So how can we morally justify an institutional agenda for digital justice when the idea at its core, almost a yardstick in a lot of the GDC clauses, is perpetuating global injustice itself? I think that's the first moral question I'll raise for you as I move on to my next argument. We, of course, can't talk about digital tech regulation without the elephants in the room being mentioned, big tech. One of the most dubious aspects of the latest draft of the GDC calls for the tech industry to co-develop industry accountability frameworks. This sounds almost like an appeal for self-regulation in an industry which has perhaps the most problematic history when it comes to self-regulation. And if one were to listen to what the corporate boosters of big tech say to the press, it's not really very inspiring when it comes to the future about what they see to be their responsibility. And here too, the structural disadvantage is likely to be borne by the global south. Digital colonialism, as faddist as the word sounds, is a thing. Take, for example, Huawei's smart city projects in Kenya. These initiatives implemented surveillance systems in Nairobi, in Mombasa. They were supposed to promise improved urban management and public safety. But a lot of questions arose. How much of that data is going to the Chinese government? What's going to be the long-term impact of this surveillance on privacy, on social control and social norms? Who's going to bear the financial burden of maintaining and upgrading these systems? Similar questions arose in the case of Facebook's Free Basics program in Southeast Asia. This was marketed as this benighted effort to provide free internet access, but uh, what it's done is it's created what critics call a walled garden. A restricted, circumscribed, curated version of the internet, which not only stifles local innovation, it gets its hand on a dangerously high amount of data in emerging markets. It entrenches corporate dominance, and it's not philanthropy, it's profit. And it limits the digital self-sufficiency of a lot of the regions that it covers. This brings me to another very important aspect of how the Global Digital Compact's framing of digital rights and digital justice needs to be tweaked. It's almost as if the definition of digital rights has been reduced to individual freedom and to privacy, without so much as a mention of trade and intellectual property rights regimes, which perpetuate a lot of the inequities in the global digital order. Uh, Big tech pursues aggressive patenting strategies. They squelch a lot of the innovation when it comes to AI. They lobby for digital trade policy rules. They don't want global south governments to get their hands on algorithmic source code for public interest intervention. So there has been, on the part of big tech, a systematic erosion of institutional norms and rules. And even though there is a section in the GDC which talks about expanding inclusion in and benefits from the digital economy for all, the compact does not commit itself to addressing the barriers posed by current trade and IPR frameworks. There's also a case to be made, almost as a corollary to this argument, on the skewed nature of the market mechanisms which the GDC employs to spur innovation in the global south. The GDC approach is of bridging digital infrastructure deficits in the global south through private sector investment as the primary source. This is deeply flawed, and I'll show you how it blends into the digital colonialism argument through a very simple example. Recently, Meta claimed to have an AI language model that provided state-of-the-art translation in more than 200 languages. This was supposed to include around 54 African languages, and it was found that the quality of those translations was not very good when it came to languages like Amharic, Tigrina, and some dialects of Twi. In these specific languages, on the other hand, there were local companies like Ghana NLP and Lisan, which outperformed Meta's products. Not only did Meta's product, because of the hype that Meta had, drive away investment from local groups like Ghana NLP and Lisan, the sheer hype of a big company like Meta disadvantaged every local competitor out there. There has to be unequivocal international public financing commitments for digital infrastructure development in the global south. The UN has come up with interesting ideas, the official development assistance mechanisms like the Global Digital Development Tax proposed by the Secretary General himself, no less, and the Global Financial Transactions Tax, which has come up as a very interesting idea from a lot of civil society groups. So, as I come to the conclusion of my presentation, I hope to have illustrated that the GDC is definitely not perfect. I don't mean to say that it's not an interesting and very important initiative, but we need to understand that it still approaches the globe with the same sense of disproportion that has eroded the credibility of multilateral talk in much of the global south. Let's not lose sight of the fact that multilateralism is in crisis today because of very negative incentives that it created in the past. Even the splinternet that we spoke about almost goes hand in hand with the changing nature of multilateralism itself. The shift from multilateral diplomacy to minilateral diplomacy. Groups like BRICS, where digital solidarity is becoming an agenda. So, multilateralism is a mirror to the world. It reflects our hopes, our aspirations, our convergences, and our divergences. Now that this creature of its member states, the UN, has a lot of middle powers, so-called middle powers, which find greater space, greater public perception, and a deeper sense of responsibility, maybe it is high time that we are much more wary of creating the same perverse incentives that roiled the UN's credibility in the past. Hopefully, that gives you some food for thought. With this submission, I conclude my presentation. Thank you.